Commercial dishwashers generally require a separate disconnect. Most models do not have an integral disconnect switch that meets the requirements for disconnecting all phases of the power supply. Therefore, it is generally necessary to install a separate disconnect switch. When preparing bid documents for a project where the specific dishwasher model is unknown, including a disconnect in the bid is advisable. Consider specifying a stainless steel National Electrical Manufacturers Association or NEMA Type 4 disconnect to ensure it is suitable for the environment in a commercial kitchen. To avoid unnecessary costs, include a note in the bid documents allowing the contractor to provide documentation demonstrating that the disconnect is not required for the specific dishwasher model selected. This puts the onus on the contractor to verify and potentially save money while ensuring compliance with electrical codes. An alternative approach is to specify a dishwasher with an integral disconnect. While these dishwashers are generally more expensive than models without an integral disconnect, they eliminate the need for the contractor to install a separate disconnect, potentially resulting in cost savings overall. When evaluating the cost effectiveness of these options, consider the cost of the dishwasher with and without an integral disconnect along with the cost of purchasing and installing a separate disconnect. The decision of whether to include a separate disconnect in the bid documents or specify a dishwasher with an integral disconnect will depend on the specific requirements of the project and the available budget. Factors to consider include the cost of the equipment, the cost of labor, and the importance of minimizing potential delays. Electrical codes typically require a disconnecting means to be readily accessible and located within sight of the equipment it serves. This is to ensure that maintenance personnel can safely energize the equipment before performing any work. When a dishwasher does not have an integral disconnect, a separate disconnect switch must be installed to comply with these requirements. The disconnect switch must be rated for the voltage and amperage of the dishwasher, and it must be properly grounded. The disconnect switch must be installed in a location that is readily accessible and within sight of the dishwasher. When selecting a disconnect switch, it is important to consider the environmental conditions in which it will be installed. In a commercial kitchen, the disconnect switch may be exposed to moisture, grease, and other contaminants. Therefore, it is important to select a disconnect switch that is rated for these conditions, such as the NEMA Type 4 enclosure. Some manufacturers offer dishwashers with an integral disconnect switch that meets the requirements of electrical codes. These dishwashers typically have a disconnect switch located on the front of the unit, making it easy to access and operate. When specifying a dishwasher with an integral disconnect switch, it is important to verify that the switch is properly rated for the voltage and amperage of the dishwasher and that it meets all applicable electrical codes. Some jurisdictions may have specific requirements for dishwashers with integral disconnect switches, such as requiring that the switch be lockable in the open position. The National Electrical Code, or NEC, provides guidelines for the installation of electrical equipment, including dishwashers. Article 422.31 of the NEC covers the disconnecting means for appliances. This article requires that appliances be provided with a means to disconnect them from all ungrounded conductors. The disconnecting means must be readily accessible and within sight of the appliance, or it must be capable of being locked in the open position. For dishwashers, the disconnecting means can be either a switch or a circuit breaker. If a switch is used, it must be rated for the voltage and amperage of the dishwasher. If a circuit breaker is used, it must be readily accessible and clearly marked as the disconnecting means for the dishwasher. When installing a dishwasher, it is important to follow all applicable electrical codes and manufacturer's instructions. This will help to ensure that the dishwasher is installed safely and correctly, and that it will operate reliably for many years. In addition to the NEC, some local jurisdictions may have additional requirements for the installation of dishwashers. It is important to check with the local electrical inspector to determine if there are any specific requirements that must be followed. Specifying a dishwasher with an integral disconnect can simplify the installation process and reduce the overall cost of the project. However, it is important to carefully evaluate the cost of the dishwasher with and without an integral disconnect, as well as the cost of installing a separate disconnect to determine the most cost-effective solution. When preparing bid documents for a project, it is important to provide clear and concise information about the disconnect requirements for the dishwasher. This will help to ensure that all bidders are aware of the requirements and that they can accurately estimate the cost of the project. The bid document should specify whether a separate disconnect is required or whether a dishwasher with an integral disconnect is acceptable. If a separate disconnect is required, the bid document should specify the type of disconnect required, such as a stainless steel NEMA Type 4 disconnect. The bid document should also specify the location where the disconnect is to be installed. By providing clear and concise information about the disconnect requirements, the bid documents will help to ensure that the project is completed on time and within budget. Remember that it is always best to consult with a qualified electrical contractor or engineer to ensure that all electrical work is performed in accordance with applicable codes and regulations. This will help to ensure the safety of the installation and the reliable operation of the equipment. Consider the long-term maintenance requirements when deciding whether to specify a dishwasher with an integral disconnect or a separate disconnect. An integral disconnect may be more convenient for routine maintenance, as it eliminates the need to locate and operate a separate disconnect switch. However, a separate disconnect may be easier to replace if it fails. When evaluating the different options, consider the availability of replacement parts and the ease of maintenance for each type of disconnect. Consider the impact of the disconnect location on the overall layout of the kitchen. An integral disconnect may allow for more flexibility in the placement of the dishwasher, as it eliminates the need to find a suitable location for a separate disconnect switch. However, a separate disconnect may be more accessible if it is located in a convenient location, such as near the entrance to the kitchen. When designing the kitchen layout, consider the location of the disconnect and its impact on the flow of traffic and the overall functionality of the space. Ensure that the selected disconnect meets all applicable safety standards. Disconnect switches must be listed by a recognized testing laboratory such as Underwriters Laboratories or Canadian Standards Association, and they must meet all applicable safety standards. Verify that the disconnect switch is properly rated for the voltage and amperage of the dishwasher, and that it is suitable for the environmental conditions in which it will be installed. Selecting a disconnect switch that meets all applicable safety standards is essential to ensure the safety of the installation and the protection of personnel. If a separate disconnect is used, ensure that it is properly labeled. The disconnect switch must be clearly labeled to indicate that it is the disconnecting means for the dishwasher. This will help to ensure that maintenance personnel can easily identify the correct disconnect switch when performing work on the dishwasher. The label should be durable and weather-resistant, and it should be securely attached to the disconnect switch. If a dishwasher with an integral disconnect is selected, ensure that the disconnect is clearly marked on the dishwasher. The marking should indicate the voltage and amperage rating of the disconnect, and it should be located in a prominent location on the dishwasher. This will help to ensure that maintenance personnel can easily identify the disconnecting means for the dishwasher. Coordinate with other trades to ensure that the disconnect is properly installed. The installation of the disconnect switch may require coordination with other trades such as plumbers and HVAC contractors. Ensure that all trades are aware of the disconnect requirements and that they coordinate their work to ensure that the disconnect is properly installed. For example, the plumber may need to install a water shut-off valve near the dishwasher, and the HVAC contractor may need to install a ventilation hood above the dishwasher. By coordinating with other trades, you can help to ensure that the disconnect is properly installed and that the dishwasher operates safely and efficiently. Document the disconnect location and details in the project drawings and specifications. The location and details of the disconnect switch should be clearly documented in the project drawings and specifications. This will help to ensure that the disconnect is installed in the correct location and that it meets all applicable requirements. The drawings should show the location of the disconnect switch in relation to the dishwasher, and the specification should include the type of disconnect switch required, as well as any other relevant information. The documentation should be accurate and up to date, and it should be readily available to all parties involved in the project. Consider using a disconnect switch with a built-in overcurrent protection device. Some disconnect switches are available with a built-in overcurrent protection device, such as a fuse or circuit breaker. This can provide additional protection for the dishwasher and help to prevent electrical damage. If the dishwasher is subject to frequent overloads or short circuits, a disconnect switch with a built-in overcurrent protection device may be a good option. However, it is important to ensure that the overcurrent protection device is properly sized for the dishwasher and that it meets all applicable requirements. When selecting a disconnect switch, consider the ease of operation. The disconnect switch should be easy to operate, even for personnel wearing gloves. The switch should have a clear and unambiguous indication of its on or off position, and it should be easy to grip and turn. If the disconnect switch is difficult to operate, it may not be used properly, which could compromise the safety of the installation. When installing the disconnect switch, ensure that it is properly grounded. Grounding is essential for the safe operation of electrical equipment. The disconnect switch must be properly grounded to prevent electrical shock and to provide a path for fault current to flow back to the source. The grounding conductor must be properly sized and connected to a suitable grounding electrode. If the disconnect switch is not properly grounded, it could create a serious safety hazard. If the dishwasher is located in a damp or wet environment, consider using a disconnect switch with a watertight enclosure. In damp or wet environments, the disconnect switch may be exposed to moisture, which could damage the switch and create a safety hazard. A watertight enclosure will protect the disconnect switch from moisture and ensure that it operates safely and reliably. The enclosure must be properly sealed to prevent water from entering, and it must be made of a corrosion-resistant material. Consider the voltage drop when selecting the wire size for the disconnect switch. Voltage drop is the reduction in voltage that occurs when electricity flows through a wire. Excessive voltage drop can cause the dishwasher to operate inefficiently and may even damage the equipment. When selecting the wire size for the disconnect switch, it is important to consider the length of the wire run and the amperage of the dishwasher. The wire size must be large enough to minimize voltage drop and ensure that the dishwasher operates properly. The NEC provides guidelines for calculating voltage drop and selecting the appropriate wire size. Consider the ambient temperature when selecting the disconnect switch. The ambient temperature is the temperature of the air surrounding the disconnect switch. High ambient temperatures can cause the disconnect switch to overheat and fail. When selecting the disconnect switch, it is important to consider the ambient temperature in which it will be installed. The disconnect switch must be rated for the maximum ambient temperature that it will be exposed to. If the disconnect switch is installed in a hot environment, it may be necessary to use a disconnect switch with a higher temperature rating. Before installing the disconnect switch, thoroughly inspect it for any damage. Before installing the disconnect switch, thoroughly inspect it for any damage, such as cracks, dents, or loose connections. If the disconnect switch is damaged, it should not be installed. A damaged disconnect switch could create a safety hazard and may not operate properly. If the disconnect switch is damaged, it should be replaced with a new one. Always follow the manufacturer's instructions when installing the disconnect switch. The manufacturer's instructions provide detailed information on how to install the disconnect switch properly. Following the manufacturer's instructions will help to ensure that the disconnect switch is installed safely and correctly. If you are not familiar with the installation procedures, consult with a qualified electrical contractor. The bid document should specify the performance requirements for the disconnect switch. The performance requirements for the disconnect switch should be clearly specified in the bid documents. This will help to ensure that all bidders are aware of the requirements and that they can accurately estimate the cost of the project. The performance requirements should include the voltage and amperage rating of the disconnect switch, as well as any other relevant information such as the NEMA rating and the temperature rating. The bid document should also specify the testing and inspection requirements for the disconnect switch. The testing and inspection requirements for the disconnect switch should be clearly specified in the bid documents. This will help to ensure that the disconnect switch is properly tested and inspected before it is installed. The testing and inspection requirements should include the procedures for verifying the voltage and amperage rating of the disconnect switch, as well as any other relevant tests such as insulation resistance tests and current continuity tests. The bid document should also specify the documentation requirements for the disconnect switch. The documentation requirements for the disconnect switch should be clearly specified in the bid document. This will help to ensure that all relevant information about the disconnect switch is properly documented. The documentation requirements should include the manufacturer's name and model number, the voltage and amperage rating, the NEM rating, the temperature rating, and the results of any testing and inspection. The documentation should be readily available to all parties involved in the project. Consider the future expansion needs when selecting the disconnect switch. If there is a possibility that the dishwasher will be upgraded in the future, it is important to select a disconnect switch that can accommodate the increased load. The disconnect switch should have a voltage and amperage rating that is sufficient for the future dishwasher. It may also be necessary to upgrade the wiring to the disconnect switch to accommodate the increased load. By considering the future expansion needs, you can avoid having to replace the disconnect switch in the future. If the dishwasher is connected to a generator, ensure that the disconnect switch is compatible with the generator. If the dishwasher is connected to a generator, it is important to ensure that the disconnect switch is compatible with the generator. The disconnect switch should be able to handle the voltage and amperage output of the generator, and it should be able to withstand the transient voltages that can occur when the generator starts and stops. It may also be necessary to install a transfer switch to switch between the utility power and the generator power.